Welcome to biology. This lesson focuses on the evidence for evolution. So, there are three main components that we're going to be looking at that demonstrate evidence for evolution today. One is fossils, two is comparing anatomy, and three is biochemistry. So, we're going to look at how we compare proteins that organisms make and DNA that organisms have in order to provide evidence for evolution. We'll start off with fossils. First, we'll start by examining what fossils are. So, fossils are remains or traces of organisms that no longer exist. Fossils can show that organisms have changed over time. In other words, fossils can show how the structure of an organism has changed. So if you look at the diagram on the right-hand side, this gives you an example of horses. Up at the top is our modern horse that evolved about 1 million years ago. And if you look, we can trace back the evolutionary origin of a horse 60 million years. So if you look at the bone structure at the very bottom of the horse from 60 million years ago, then you can see that that's a little bit different than this guy from 40 million years ago. And then you can see that there are very subtle changes with passing time until you get to the appendage that is on our modern horse. So that's what the fossil record really does. Even though there are gaps in the fossil record, it does allow us to compare organisms that lived in different time periods and see how certain structures have changed over time. To know how things have changed and what order or sequence they have changed, we have to date those fossils. And we do this in a couple of different ways. One is relative dating. And when we relatively date things, we are dating them in relation to other fossils. And what we do when we are dating them this way is we look at their position in the rock strata. And so if you take a look at the diagram on the right-hand side, you can see that there are several layers of rock strata. And within those several layers, there are different fossils. Just because of natural processes that have occurred on the planet, such as erosion, for example, the older fossils will be on the bottom. So we would say that these fossils down here in this region would be old compared to fossils up here in this region, which would be our newer or more modern or more recent organisms. So that's relative dating, as we're looking at where fossils are in the rocks compared to one another. The other type of dating that we use to date fossils is absolute dating. And we use radioactive isotopes to do this. And you may have heard of carbon dating. So that's where we use carbon-14. But we can use other radioactive isotopes as well, like potassium. And we're not really going to focus on what isotopes are at this point in time. You'll learn more about that in chemistry. But if you look on the left there, under absolute dating, you can see that carbon-14 can date fossils up to 50,000 years old. And then potassium, which is another radioactive isotope, can date fossils that are much older than 50,000 years. Moving to our second piece of evidence for evolution, comparing anatomy. So when we compare anatomy, we are observing structural or anatomical similarities between organisms. So we can take a look at this baleen whale down at the bottom compared to a hummingbird. And we may think of those as very different organisms, and they are. But even though they're different, they have structural similarities. So we can see they both have a skull, they both have a humerus and an ulna and a radius and phalanges, which are basically fingers. They both have ribs, they both have hind limbs. So there are a lot of similarities between a whale that lives in the ocean and a hummingbird, which is a bird that has the ability to fly. One of the ways that we compare organisms are by structural analysis of homologous structures. We've seen this term before, homologous or homos, which means same. And so in this case, homologous structures are body parts that are similar in design. So structurally, they're the same or very similar, not necessarily in function. So if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that we have the four-limb structures of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. Now, obviously, humans with our front appendages, we can do 1,000,001 different things. Cats can pounce, claw, catch food. Whales can swim. Bats can fly. So functionally, they're different, but structurally, they are very similar. And those bones are highlighted that are similar to one another. They're color-coded. Analogous structures, second bullet. Body parts that are similar in function, but not in design. And so that we don't have a diagram of that up here, but an example of that would be, and we'll stick with the example of the bat. So bat wings and then insect wings. So bat wings, bats are mammals and they have bones. Insects do not have bones, but they both have wings, which are both have the same function, which is flight. And so that would be an example of analogous structures. Both of these homologous structures where organisms have the same type of structure, but not necessarily the same function, and analogous structures both provide evidence for evolution. Now, the first homologous structures suggest that the organisms have a common ancestor. Analogous structures don't necessarily suggest that they have a common ancestor. Instead, they provide evidence that the same trait, in the example that I gave you, that trait being flight, has been selected for under similar conditions in different types of organisms. So we're looking at the different traits that are selected for with analogous structures. Vestigial structures, and you may have heard of these before, whether you've heard of them called vestigial or not. These are structures that are useless in modern organisms, but may have had a function in an ancestor. And just a couple of examples here. Appendix. So your appendix, it has absolutely no functional role that we know of inside your body. However, because of its close association with the intestines, we think that it might have had played a role in digestive processes. Whales, if we look at whales, another example of this is snakes. They have pelvic bones, which indicate that their common ancestor had hind limbs, but that trait has been lost over time. So again, vestigial structures are structures that don't perform a function in a modern ancestor, but had a function in a common ancestor. Last but not least, the other piece of evidence we have for evolution is biochemistry. And so we started out in Unit 1 in organic chemistry, and we looked at carbs and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. So for biochemistry, what we do is we compare two organisms' biochemistry. And what that means is we either compare the DNA or we compare the amino acid sequences in their proteins. And the closer two organisms' DNA are, the more closely they're related. The closer two organisms have proteins with similar or the same amino acid sequences, then the closer their relationships. If two organisms have a lot of differences in their DNA or their amino acid sequences, that means they're not related to one another, or at least not closely related to one another. Taking a look at biochemistry, so continuing on here, if we look at the chart on the right, we have several different species. We have a human, a horse, a gorilla, a chimpanzee, and a zebra. And what we also have are sequence of amino acids in the same part of hemoglobin molecules. So remember, hemoglobin is the protein in red blood cells that carry oxygen. So all of these organisms have a circulatory system. They all have red blood cells. They all have hemoglobin. The hemoglobin performs the same function, which is to carry oxygen. And so what we're doing is comparing the the amino acids in this hemoglobin between these different species, and we're looking at how many amino acids they have that are different from humans. So if we look at the horse has 3 amino acids that are different. If we look at the gorilla has only 1. The zebra has 3 like the horse, but look at the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee does not have any amino acids that are different than the human DNA. And what that would tell us and how we would interpret this is we would say that humans and chimps are more closely related than humans and gorillas, or humans and zebras, or humans and horses. So, what do the number of differences mean? The number of differences tell how closely or distantly related two organisms are. If there are only a few differences, that means that those two organisms are very closely related. And if there are many differences, that means they're distantly related, because all organisms are related, regardless of whether it's close or distant. We all have common ancestry. So if you look at this, and I'm going to show you a few of these diagrams known as cladograms or phylogenetic trees. If we look, these two individuals right here are more closely related than a human and a dog per se. Or if we look at the bird and the frog, we would say because they're close on this diagram, the bird and the frog are more closely related than the dog and the frog, for example. So what we do is we take information like biochemical similarities, DNA comparisons, amino acid comparisons, or it could be those homologous structures. We could be comparing structural anatomy, and we group organisms together on these diagrams based on their similarities. So we're going to take a look at a few of these. So cladograms, and we'll call them that. Sometimes you see them represented as phylogenetic trees. And so notice down here at the bottom of this, you have a common ancestor. And so the way you're going to read these, you'll either read them from bottom to top or left to right, but you start out with a common ancestor at one location. So we would say whatever this organism used to be right here is the common ancestor for individual 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And so what we might have to do is determine which two organisms are the most closely related if they gave us several pairs of organisms. And I'll just point out a couple of things here. We would say that 3 and 4 are very closely related because they're on the same branch. So 3 and 4 would be more closely related than like individual 2 and 4, for example. 5 and 6, same thing. They're on the same branch there. So we would say that 5 and 6 are very closely related. So 5 and 6 are more closely related than, say, individuals 1 and 2, because they're closer together on this cladogram. Here's another example of a cladogram. And so same thing applies. So down here is our common ancestor. So we're kind of going from top to bottom, but we're also going from left to right. And so every time this branches, that means a new characteristic has evolved through the process of natural selection. And so what we would say, for example, is we could say flatworms and rotifers are very closely related. Or we could say mollusks and arthropods are closely related, but not as close as earthworms and rotifers because they're right next to one another. We could also say echinoderms and chordates are closely related. They're more closely related than mollusks and arthropods because they're closer together on this cladogram. And that's how you read one of these. You're basically looking at the distance organisms are apart or how close the organisms are together, and making a determination about which organisms are more closely related and which organisms are more distantly related.